In the library, the counselor tapped my shoulder and said, "The police are here about last night." Mrs. Brennan's hand on my shoulder felt like 1,000 pounds as I looked up from my calculus homework. Her face had that careful expression adults wear when they're about to destroy your world, but want to seem calm about it. "The police are here about last night," she repeated when I didn't move, and every person in the library turned to stare at me. My best friend Zoe dropped her highlighter, and it rolled across the floor, making the only sound in the sudden silence. I hadn't done anything last night except argue with my stepdad Craig about curfew and go to bed early, so why were the police here asking about me? I gathered my stuff with shaking hands while everyone whispered behind their notebooks. The walk to the counseling office felt like a mile, even though it was just down the hall. 2 officers stood waiting, a younger woman with kind eyes and an older man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. They asked me to sit down, and Mrs. Brennan closed the door but stayed in the room, which made my stomach drop even further. The female officer, Detective Rivera, pulled out a notebook and asked if I knew where my stepfather Craig was. I said he should be at work at the construction site like always, but she shook her head slowly. "Craig never showed up for work this morning," she said carefully. "His truck was found abandoned on Route 47 near the bridge. His wallet and phone were still inside." The room started spinning a little, and I gripped the armrest of the chair. Craig and I didn't get along great since he married Mom 3 years ago, but he wouldn't just disappear. Mom was flying back from a business trip in Chicago and wouldn't land for another 2 hours. Detective Rivera asked about our argument last night, and I explained it was just normal stuff about me wanting to go to Zoe's party on Saturday, and him saying no because Mom wasn't home to give permission. The male detective, Sergeant Mills, leaned forward and asked if Craig had any enemies or problems I knew about. I started to say no, then remembered the weird phone calls that had been coming to the house lately. Craig would answer and immediately go outside to talk, coming back looking stressed and angry. When I'd asked about it once, he'd snapped at me to mind my own business. I told the detectives about the calls, and they exchanged a look that made my chest tight with anxiety. Rivera asked if I'd noticed anything else unusual lately, and suddenly I remembered the man who'd been parked outside our house 3 times this week. I described the black sedan with tinted windows that would sit there for hours, always leaving right before Craig got home from work. The detectives wrote everything down and asked more questions about Craig's routine, his friends, his work. Then Rivera asked something that made my blood go cold. "Did Craig ever mention someone named Vincent Moretti?" The name sounded familiar, but I couldn't place it. She showed me a photo on her phone of a heavy-set man with dead eyes and a scar across his left cheek. I'd never seen him before, but something about the photo made me want to run out of the room. Mrs. Brennan suggested calling my mom, but the detective said they'd already sent officers to meet her at the airport. That's when I knew this was really serious, not just Craig being dramatic or having some midlife crisis. Rivera asked if we had security cameras at home, and I remembered Craig had installed a Ring doorbell last month after he thought someone had been in our garage. My hands fumbled with my phone as I pulled up the app, and we scrolled through the footage from last night together. At 11:47 p.m., long after I'd gone to bed, the camera showed Craig leaving the house in jeans and a hoodie, looking around nervously before getting in his truck. But then, at 11:52 p.m., another figure appeared in frame, following on foot in the direction Craig had driven. The person wore all black and kept their face turned away from the camera, but their build matched the photo of Vincent Moretti. Detective Rivera immediately called for a unit to secure our house, and told Mrs. Brennan I couldn't go home until they'd swept it for evidence. The thought of strangers going through our stuff made me feel sick, but not as sick as wondering what had happened to Craig after he'd left. Mills asked if Craig had a gun, and I said yes. He kept one in the bedroom safe, which made them exchange another one of those meaningful looks. Zoe was allowed to come sit with me while we waited for Mom to land. She held my hand while I told her everything, and her eyes got wider with each detail. She reminded me about something I'd completely forgotten. Last week at the mall, Craig had been acting paranoid, constantly looking over his shoulder and rushing us through our shopping. He'd even made us leave through a different exit than we'd entered, claiming he wanted to avoid traffic, but now it seemed like he'd been avoiding someone. Zoe's mom arrived to take us to her house since I couldn't go home, and the detectives said they'd be in touch soon with updates. At Zoe's house, I couldn't eat the sandwich her mom made, and I kept checking my phone every 2 seconds for news from Mom or the police. Finally, at 3:15 p.m., Mom called crying so hard I could barely understand her. She was at the police station, and they'd found blood in Craig's truck but no body. The blood matched Craig's type, and there was enough of it that the detectives were now treating this as a potential homicide. Mom kept saying this was all her fault, which made no sense until she admitted something that changed everything. Craig wasn't who I thought he was, and neither was she. Mom explained through her tears that Craig's real name was Christopher Walsh, and they were both in witness protection. 3 years ago, before they'd met me, they'd testified against Vincent Moretti's crime family in Philadelphia after Craig had accidentally witnessed a murder while working construction on one of Moretti's buildings. The FBI had relocated them to our small town in Iowa, given them new identities, and Mom had met me and my biological dad at the hospital where she'd started working as a nurse. When my dad had died in a car accident 2 years ago, Mom and Craig had gotten married and tried to build a normal life, never telling me about their past because they thought they were safe. But Moretti had found them. Mom said the U.S. Marshals were on their way to pick us up and take us to a safe house. I couldn't process any of it. My entire life had been built on lies. Even Zoe's family wasn't safe to stay with now that Moretti knew where we lived. Within an hour, black SUVs pulled up to Zoe's house, and serious-looking federal agents escorted me and Mom into a vehicle. I barely had time to hug Zoe goodbye before they drove us away. Mom held my hand in the back seat, but I pulled away, angry and scared, and feeling like I didn't even know who she was anymore. The safe house was a plain apartment in a city 2 hours away. The Marshals, Agent Chen and Agent Kowalski, explained that they'd been monitoring chatter suggesting Moretti had never stopped looking for Craig and Mom. Someone in the program had leaked their location for money, and now Craig was missing. probably taken for revenge or to prevent him from testifying in an upcoming appeal case. They showed us photos from traffic cameras near the bridge where Craig's truck was found, and in one fuzzy image, you could see what looked like Craig being forced into a van by two large men. He appeared to be injured but alive, at least at that moment. Agent Chen said they had teams searching everywhere, but Moretti was smart and had resources. Our only option was to stay hidden until they found Craig or Moretti made a mistake. Mom broke down completely then, sobbing about how she should have known this would happen, how she'd ruined my life by bringing me into their mess. I wanted to comfort her, but I was so angry about the lies that I couldn't. Instead, I went to the bedroom they'd assigned me and locked the door. Everything made sense now. Why we'd moved so suddenly 2 years ago, why Mom never talked about her past, why Craig had been so paranoid about security. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound in the unfamiliar apartment made me jump. Around 2 a.m., Mom knocked on my door, and when I let her in, she looked like she'd aged 10 years in one day. She told me the real story, all of it. How she'd been Christina Valdez, working as an accountant for a company that turned out to be a front for Moretti's money laundering. How Craig had been doing construction work on a warehouse and witnessed Moretti's son executing someone who'd been skimming money. How they'd both agreed to testify in exchange for protection, thinking they could start over and leave that life behind forever. She showed me old photos on her phone from her life before. A different woman with different hair, different style, living in Philadelphia. There were pictures of Craig too, younger and carefree, before the weight of witness protection had settled on his shoulders. Mom admitted they'd fallen in love during the trial preparation, two scared people finding comfort in each other while their worlds fell apart. When they'd been relocated to Iowa, they'd tried so hard to be normal, to forget the danger that might still be out there. Meeting my dad and me had felt like a gift, a chance at the family they'd never thought they could have. The next morning, Agent Chen woke us with urgent news. A gas station security camera had captured footage of Craig 12 hours ago, alive but clearly beaten, at a rest stop 3 states away. He was with 2 men, and one was definitely Vincent Moretti's son, Anthony. They were heading west, probably to one of the Moretti family's compounds in Nevada, where law enforcement would have a harder time reaching them. The FBI was mobilizing a rescue operation, but it was delicate because Craig was likely being used as bait to draw Mom out of protection. If she showed herself, Moretti would kill them both. Mom wanted to go anyway, said she couldn't let Craig die alone, but the marshals physically blocked her from leaving. I'd never seen my composed, professional mother completely lose control, but she screamed and fought them until Agent Kowalski had to restrain her. I stood there watching my fake mother fight for her fake husband, except the pain was real, the fear was real, and maybe that's all that mattered. The love between them was real even if their names weren't. That's when I decided to help, even though I was terrified and angry and confused about everything. I remembered Craig had given me a burner phone last year, for emergencies, which had seemed weird at the time but now made perfect sense. It was hidden in my school backpack, which the marshals had grabbed from Zoe's house. While Mom was sedated with anxiety medication and the agents were coordinating with the FBI, I found the phone and powered it on. There was one number programmed in it, and when I called, Craig's voice answered, weak and raspy. "Sam, is that you, kiddo?" He'd never called me kiddo before, and hearing it now, when he might be dying, made me start crying. Craig spoke quickly, knowing we probably only had seconds. He was in a warehouse in Nevada, could see mountains through a window, and there were at least 6 men guarding him. Moretti wanted Mom to come alone to trade herself for Craig, but Craig made me promise not to let her do it. He said there was evidence hidden in our house, in the garage ceiling, that could put Moretti away forever. Recordings and documents he'd kept as insurance. He'd been gathering proof of Moretti's continued criminal activities, violating his plea deal immunity. If I could get that evidence to the FBI, they could raid Moretti's compound with full legal backing. The line went dead, and I immediately told Agent Chen everything. Within minutes, they had a team heading to our house to search the garage. I described exactly where Craig had said to look, inside the ventilation panel above his workbench. Meanwhile, the FBI tech team had traced the call to narrow down Craig's location to 3 possible warehouses in Nevada. Mom woke up as they were planning the operation, and I had to tell her about talking to Craig. She grabbed me in a hug so tight I couldn't breathe, crying and apologizing and thanking me all at once. It was the first real moment between us since everything had fallen apart. The evidence from our garage was a gold mine. Craig had been secretly recording Moretti's people when they'd started showing up in town 2 months ago. He'd documented license plates, recorded phone conversations, even captured video of Anthony Moretti meeting with the corrupt marshal who'd sold out our location. It was enough for arrest warrants and a RICO case that would destroy what was left of Moretti's organization. But we still had to find Craig before Moretti realized the FBI was closing in. Agent Chen said they had 6 hours before Moretti's planned exchange deadline, after which Craig would likely be killed. I convinced them to let me help with the operation. Not the dangerous part, but I knew Craig better than anyone except Mom. I knew his medical conditions, his medications, things that might matter if he was injured. They agreed to let me stay in the mobile command unit they were setting up in Nevada. Mom and I flew out on an FBI jet, the whole thing feeling surreal like I was in a movie, except the fear was too real for fiction. During the flight, Mom held my hand and told me more about their life before, about the terror of testifying against Moretti, about nightmares that had plagued them for years. The command unit was set up in an abandoned strip mall 5 miles from the warehouse complex where they'd pinpointed Craig's location. Dozens of agents in tactical gear were preparing for the raid while tech specialists monitored every possible communication channel. I watched on screens as drones surveyed the warehouse, thermal imaging showing 8 heat signatures inside, 1 stationary on the ground, likely Craig. Mom wasn't allowed anywhere near the operation, but they let us watch from the command center as the raid began. It happened so fast. Flashbang grenades, agents streaming in from multiple entry points, shouting in chaos. Then the shooting started. The monitors showed muzzle flashes and agents taking cover. Mom grabbed my hand so tight it hurt, both of us barely breathing as we watched. The gunfire lasted maybe 30 seconds but felt like hours. Then Agent Chen's voice came over the radio. "Target secured. We have Walsh. He's alive but needs immediate medical attention." Mom collapsed into a chair sobbing with relief, and I realized I was crying too. On the screen, we could see agents carrying Craig out on a stretcher, while others led Moretti's men away in handcuffs. Vincent Moretti himself was among them, finally captured after years of avoiding justice. Craig was flown to the nearest trauma center, and we were allowed to see him once he was stable. He looked terrible. Broken ribs, a punctured lung, his face swollen and bruised beyond recognition. But he was alive, and when he saw us, he managed a weak smile. "Hey, kiddo," he whispered to me. "Thanks for making that call." Mom kissed his forehead gently, afraid to hurt him more. The doctor said he'd need multiple surgeries and months of recovery, but he'd survive. The physical wounds would heal, though the psychological trauma would take longer to process. Agent Chen explained that with Moretti's arrest and the evidence Craig had gathered, the threat was essentially neutralized. Most of Moretti's organization had been rolled up in coordinated raids across 3 states. We could return to some version of normal life, though we'd have the option to relocate again with new identities if we wanted. Mom and Craig would have to testify again, but this time it would be the final nail in Moretti's coffin. The corrupt marshal who'd exposed us was arrested too, charged with conspiracy and endangering protected witnesses. The whole network that had hunted us was being dismantled piece by piece. 2 weeks later, we were in a new safe house while Craig recovered and the legal proceedings began. I was doing online school since returning to my regular high school was out of the question for now. Zoe and I video chatted every day, and she kept me updated on the drama I was missing, though it all seemed trivial compared to what had happened. She said everyone at school thought I'd been kidnapped or killed, and there were wild rumors about what had really happened. The official story was that we'd entered witness protection due to a family situation, which was true enough without revealing the details. Mom and I started therapy together to deal with everything. The therapist specialized in trauma and families in witness protection, which was apparently a real specialty. We talked about the lies, the fear, the anger, and slowly started rebuilding trust. Mom showed me more photos from her life as Christina, told me stories about growing up in Puerto Rico before moving to Philadelphia. She'd lost everything, her family, her friends, her identity, to do the right thing. Craig had lost even more, including a brother who'd refused to believe he wasn't involved with criminals and had cut him off completely. Craig came home from the hospital in a wheelchair, still healing, but determined to recover. He and I had our first real conversation about everything. He apologized for bringing danger into my life, for not being honest, for the argument we'd had that last night before he was taken. I told him I understood why they'd lied, even if I was still angry about it. He showed me photos of his life before too. He'd been a Marine, had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before coming home to work construction. He'd just been in the wrong place at the wrong time, and doing the right thing had cost him everything. The trial preparation was intense. Prosecutors flew in from Philadelphia, and we spent days in conference rooms going over testimony. I had to testify too, about the phone call with Craig and finding the evidence. Mom and Craig had to relive the worst moments of their lives in detail. Vincent Moretti sat across the courtroom looking like a broken old man, but his eyes still held that cold hatred when he looked at Craig. Anthony Moretti had agreed to cooperate for a reduced sentence, revealing more about the organization's operations. The whole crime family was imploding, turning on each other to save themselves. During the trial, we stayed in a hotel under federal protection. One night, Mom found me on the balcony crying. Everything had just hit me at once. My dad dying, finding out my whole life was built on lies, almost losing Craig, the constant fear. She held me while I sobbed, and for the first time since this all started, she felt like my real mom again, not Christina or whoever else she'd been. She promised that after the trial, we'd build something real together. No more lies, no more hiding. We'd choose new names together this time, create our own family story that was honest about our past but hopeful about our future. The guilty verdict was unanimous. Vincent Moretti got life without parole, and his organization was officially designated as a defunct criminal enterprise. Craig testified from his wheelchair, still recovering, his voice strong as he described what he'd witnessed and what they'd done to him. Mom testified about the financial crimes she'd uncovered, the murder she'd reported. I testified about the evidence Craig had hidden and the phone call that had helped locate him. When it was over, Agent Chen said we'd done something remarkable. We'd survived what most witnesses don't, and had helped destroy a major crime family in the process. We chose to relocate one more time, to a place none of us had been before, where we could truly start fresh. The marshals gave us a choice of 5 cities, and we picked Portland, Oregon, far from Iowa and Philadelphia and all the memories. We got to help choose our new names this time. Mom became Elena, Craig became David, and I chose to be Luna. It felt like being reborn, getting to decide who we wanted to be. The government provided job placement assistance, and Mom got work at a hospital while Craig started teaching construction skills at a vocational school once he'd fully recovered. Our new house was smaller than our old one but felt safer somehow. We installed security systems, but not the paranoid level Craig had before, just enough to feel protected. I started at a new school for senior year, and this time when people asked about my past, I had a rehearsed story that was partially true. My parents and I had moved for a fresh start after some family trauma. I made new friends who knew me as Luna, joined the drama club, started feeling normal again. Zoe and I still talked, but less frequently as we both moved forward with our separate lives. 6 months into our new life, I found Craig in the garage working on a project. Not gathering evidence this time, just building a bookshelf for my room. His hands still shook sometimes from nerve damage, but he was determined to work with them anyway. He showed me how to use the tools, taught me about measuring twice and cutting once. It was the most normal father-daughter moment we'd ever had, except we both knew how hard-won this normalcy was. Every mundane moment felt precious because we knew how quickly it could all disappear. Mom started garden in our backyard, growing vegetables and flowers. She said it helped her feel rooted after years of being ready to run. We'd have dinner on the patio, the three of us, talking about our days like a regular family. Sometimes Craig would get quiet, lost in memories of those 3 days in Moretti's warehouse, and Mom would gently touch his hand to bring him back. Sometimes Mom would jump at car backfires or unexpected knocks at the door. Sometimes I'd have nightmares about black sedans and men with guns. But we were healing, slowly, together. A year after the trial, we got word that Anthony Moretti had been killed in prison, probably ordered by his own father. It should have made us feel safer, but it just felt sad and pointless. All those destroyed lives for what? Craig said that's why they'd testified in the first place, to stop the cycle of violence, even if it had cost them everything. We marked the anniversary of Craig's rescue quietly, just grateful he was alive. He'd gained most of the weight back, could walk without pain, though he'd always have scars. We all would, just some more visible than others. I was accepted to college in Seattle, close enough to visit but far enough to have my own life. Mom cried when I got the acceptance letter, proud and sad simultaneously. Craig helped me move into my dorm, carrying boxes up 3 flights of stairs despite Mom's protests about his back. They both hugged me goodbye, and I realized these weren't the parents I'd started with, but they were mine now. We'd been forged into a family by trauma and lies and truth and survival. It wasn't the family story anyone would choose, but it was ours. During my freshman year, I studied criminal justice, inspired by Agent Chen and the prosecutors who'd fought so hard for us. My professors didn't know my real story, but one mentioned the Moretti case as an example of successful witness protection and prosecution. I sat in that lecture hall, taking notes on my own life like it was someone else's story, feeling proud and sad and angry all at once. After class, I called Mom and Craig, I still couldn't think of them as Elena and David, and told them about it. We laughed at the absurdity, me studying our own case in college. Spring break sophomore year, I brought my girlfriend Amber home to meet them. I'd told her a sanitized version of our story, that we'd been in witness protection, but we're safe now. She held my hand at dinner while Craig told jokes and Mom fussed over serving too much food. It felt so normal it was almost bizarre. This girl I loved sitting at a table with my cobbled-together family, everyone pretending we hadn't once lived through hell. Later, Amber said my parents were lovely, and I realized she was right. Somewhere along the way, they'd become lovely. Regular parents who embarrassed me and supported me and drove me crazy in all the normal ways. The U.S. Marshals checked in with us less frequently now, just annual reviews to make sure we felt safe. Agent Chen had retired, but she sent Christmas cards to our P.O. box. Always signed, stay safe, stay strong. Craig got promoted to head instructor at the vocational school. Mom became a nursing supervisor. I changed my major to social work, deciding I wanted to help kids dealing with trauma. We were building real lives, not just cover stories. The fear never fully went away, but it faded into background noise, like living near train tracks. Eventually, you stop hearing the trains. One day during senior year, I got a call from Detective Rivera, the cop who'd first told me Craig was missing. She'd kept tabs on us through official channels and wanted me to know she was proud of how I'd handled everything. She said most kids would have fallen apart, but I'd helped save Craig's life. I thanked her but said I'd just done what anyone would do. She laughed and said no, most people would have been too scared to act. She was retiring soon but wanted me to know that our case had reminded her why she became a cop. To protect families like ours, even the complicated ones built on lies and held together by truth. Graduation day, Mom and Craig sat in the auditorium beaming as I walked across the stage. My name was called Luna Martinez, Bachelor of Social Work, and they stood up cheering like embarrassing parents everywhere. Amber was there too, taking pictures and whistling. We went to dinner at a fancy restaurant, toasting with champagne, sparkling cider for me since I'd inherited Mom's dislike of alcohol after everything. Craig made a speech about being proud of the woman I'd become, and Mom cried happy tears into her napkin. It was perfect in its imperfection, this makeshift family celebrating a milestone we'd almost never gotten to reach. I got a job at a youth shelter in Portland, working with kids who'd experienced trauma. Some were in foster care, some had witnessed violence, some had lost everything. I couldn't tell them my whole story, but I could tell them survival was possible, that families could be rebuilt or built from scratch, that lies told in love could be forgiven, and truth could set you free even when it hurt. My supervisor said I had unusual insight for someone so young, and I just smiled and said I'd had good teachers. Mom and Craig volunteered at the shelter sometimes, teaching life skills and offering support to kids who needed to see adults who'd survived hard things. 3 years into my job, I got a call that would have terrified me before, but now just felt like closure. Vincent Moretti had died in prison, a heart attack in his cell. The man who'd haunted our lives for so long was gone. I called Mom and Craig, and we sat with the news separately but together. Craig said he felt nothing, just empty. Mom said she felt relief. I felt sad for the waste of it all those lives destroyed, all that pain caused. For what? A criminal empire that crumbled anyway? We didn't celebrate his death, but that night we all slept a little better, knowing that particular ghost couldn't hurt us anymore. 5 years after graduation, I married Amber in a small ceremony in Portland. Mom and Craig walked me down the aisle together, one on each arm. Zoe flew in from Iowa to be my maid of honor, marveling at how different I looked, how confident. Agent Kowalski, now retired, came as a guest, joking that it was nice to see us all at a happy event for once. During the father-daughter dance, Craig held me carefully like I might break, and I realized he'd been holding us all that carefully for years, trying to keep our fragile family from shattering. I whispered thank you in his ear, for everything, and felt him crying against my shoulder. Mom got sick the year I turned 30. Cancer. Aggressive and unfair after everything she'd survived. Craig and I took turns at the hospital, telling her stories, holding her hand. She said she wasn't afraid of dying because she'd already lived 2 lives, and the second one had been worth all the pain of losing the first. She made us promise to take care of each other, to stay in Portland, to keep building the life we'd all fought so hard to have. When she died, peacefully with us beside her, Craig and I held each other and grieved not just Elena or Christina or Mom, but all the versions of her we'd known and loved. The funeral was small but meaningful. Some coworkers, some neighbors, Amber's family who'd adopted us as their own. Nobody there knew the full story except Craig and me, and that felt right somehow. We buried her under her chosen name with a headstone that read, "Beloved wife, mother, survivor." Craig and I stood at her grave afterward, two people who'd been thrown together by violence and lies but had chosen to become family. He was my dad now in every way that mattered, even if biology and paperwork said otherwise. We'd earned each other through blood and truth, and the choice to stay when everything else fell apart. Craig lived another 10 years, teaching until the end, building furniture in his garage workshop, walking me down the aisle again when Amber and I renewed our vows for our 10th anniversary. When his heart finally gave out, worn down by the old injuries and the weight of carrying so many secrets for so long, I was holding his hand. His last words were, "Tell your mom I'm coming home," and I chose to believe he meant Elena, not whoever he'd left behind to become David. I scattered both their ashes in the ocean, setting free all the identities they'd carried, all the lives they'd lived and lost and rebuilt. I'm 50 now, with teenagers of my own who know their grandparents died when they were young but don't know the whole story. Maybe someday I'll tell them about witness protection and the Morettis, and how their grandparents were heroes who gave up everything to do the right thing. Or maybe I'll just tell them their grandparents loved them, which is the only truth that really matters. Amber knows the full story now, told over years in pieces I could manage. She says I'm brave, but I'm just someone who learned young that family is who shows up when the world falls apart, that love can bloom in the ruins of lies, and that sometimes the only way forward is through. Sometimes I drive past our old house, the one where Craig was taken, where our old life ended and our new one began. Another family lives there now, kids playing in the yard, normal life happening behind those walls. They don't know about the evidence hidden in the garage ceiling or the blood in the driveway that night, or the fear that once lived in every corner. That's how it should be. Every family has its secrets, its traumas, its lies told in love and truths that cut deep. Ours were just more dramatic than most, laid out in courtrooms and safe houses and new identities chosen from lists. The library where Mrs. Brennan found me that day was torn down last year to build a new shopping complex. I stood watching the demolition, remembering that moment when she'd said the police were here about last night, when everything I thought I knew started unraveling. That scared girl doing calculus homework feels like a stranger now, someone I once was before I became Luna, before I learned that parents could have multiple names and still love you truly, before I understood that survival sometimes means letting go of who you were to become who you need to be. When my kids ask about their heritage, I tell them they're part Puerto Rican, part Polish, part Irish, a mix of everything their grandparents were across all their identities. When they ask why we don't have many family photos from before they were born, I say they were lost in a flood, which is true enough. A flood of violence and fear that washed away our old lives. When they ask if I miss my parents, I say yes, every day, which is the complete truth. I miss Mom and Craig, Christina and Christopher, Elena and David, all the versions of them I got to love. Last week, I got a letter forwarded through multiple addresses. No return label. Inside was a photo I'd never seen before. Mom, Craig, and me at a restaurant, laughing at something, looking like a normal family. On the back, someone had written, "Thought you should have this." A C. Agent Chen, somehow still looking out for us after all these years. I framed it and put it on my desk at work. This proof that we'd been happy despite everything. My coworkers think it's sweet I keep old family photos around. They have no idea that photo represents victory over a crime family, survival against odds, and the choice to become family when everything else was stripped away. This is my story, or at least the version I can tell. There are sealed court records with more details, FBI files with crime scene photos, witness protection documents with our real names. But those aren't the true story. The true story is three broken people choosing each other again and again, through lies and truth, through violence and peace, through loss and whatever comes after. It's Craig teaching me to use power tools with shaking hands, Mom growing tomatoes in our Portland garden, me holding their hands as they died, knowing they were loved completely by someone who knew all their names. The counselor who'd tapped my shoulder in the library that day, Mrs. Brennan, sent me a message on Facebook last month. She'd retired but remembered me, wondered how I was doing after that terrible day when the police came. I wrote back that I was fine, that everything had worked out, that I'd become a social worker helping traumatized kids. I didn't tell her the rest because she didn't need to know. Some stories are meant to be sealed, carried by the few who lived them, shared only when the truth might help someone else survive. This is mine, written down finally after decades of carrying it alone, because someone needs to remember that we were real, all of us, in all our incarnations. The police had come about last night, about Craig's disappearance, about the unraveling of our carefully constructed lies. But they'd also come about our future, about the family we'd become through choosing truth over comfort, love over fear. Every name we'd worn, every lie we'd told, every moment of terror had led us to Portland, to peace, to the strange and beautiful family we'd built from the wreckage. Mom's garden still grows in the backyard of the house where she died. Craig's furniture fills my home, and I carry their story, their stories, all of them, forward into whatever comes next, teaching my own kids that family isn't about blood or birth certificates or even truth. It's about who stands with you when the world discovers your real name and loves you anyway. The library is gone. Mrs. Brennan is retired. Agents Chen and Kowalski are probably enjoying their pensions somewhere warm. Vincent and Anthony Moretti are dead. Their empire dissolved. Craig and Mom are ashes in the ocean. But I'm still here, Still Luna Martinez. Still that terrified girl in the library who became something stronger through breaking. My children don't know their grandmother was Cristina Valdez, who became Elena Martinez, or that their grandfather was Christopher Walsh, who became David Martinez. They just know they were loved by grandparents who would have done anything to protect them, which is the only truth that will ever matter. When I train new social workers at this shelter, I tell them that families are complicated, that love can exist alongside lies, that survival sometimes looks like betrayal. I tell them about kids who've witnessed terrible things but grown into remarkable adults. I tell them resilience isn't about being unbreakable, but about choosing how to rebuild after breaking. I don't tell them I'm speaking from experience, that I'm the case study, the success story, the girl who helped save her fake father and forgave her lying mother and built a life on the ashes of witness protection. That's my secret to carry, my truth to hold. This story ends where it began, in a library, though a different one. I'm writing this in the Portland Public Library, at a quiet table in the corner, surrounded by the normal hum of people living regular lives. Nobody here knows who I really am, all the names I've carried, all the lies I've lived. They just see a middle-aged woman typing away, maybe writing a novel or working on a report. They don't know I'm documenting a story about identity and family and survival, about the moment a counselor tapped my shoulder and said the police were here about last night, changing everything forever. They don't need to know. Some stories are meant to be hidden in plain sight, carried by ordinary people who've lived through extraordinary things and chosen to keep living anyway. The text from Craig's burner phone is still saved in my messages, moved through 5 different phones over the years but never deleted. Hey kiddo, thanks for making that call. 6 words that saved his life and changed mine. I read them sometimes when I need to remember that doing the right thing, even when you're terrified, even when your whole world is built on lies, is always worth it. That family can be forged in crisis and strengthened by truth. That love transcends names and identities and even death. That sometimes the police come for you not because you've done something wrong, but because you're the only one who can make things right. This is my testimony. Not for any court, but for history. For my children when they're old enough to understand. For anyone who's ever discovered their life was built on lies and had to decide whether to run or rebuild. We rebuilt. We chose each other through everything. And in the end, that choice, to stay, to love, to become family despite the deception, was the only truth that mattered. The counselor tapped my shoulder that day in the library and ended one life, but she also began another. This one, the real one. The one where I got to choose my own name and make my own family and tell my own story. Finally, after all these years of carrying everyone else's secrets. The library is closing soon. I'll save this document, encrypt it, hide it in the cloud under a name that means nothing to anyone but me. Someday, when my children are adults, when the last sealed record has been destroyed, when nobody remembers the Moretti crime family or the witnesses who brought them down, I'll give them the password. They'll read this and understand why they don't have extended family, why their grandparents had so few photos, why their mother sometimes stares at nothing and whispers, "Hey kiddo," to the air. They'll understand that they come from survivors, from people who chose love over safety, truth over comfort, family over everything. But for now, this story stays hidden, like we once were, protected and secret and safe. I close my laptop and walk out of the library into the Portland evening, just another woman heading home to her family, carrying stories nobody would believe, wearing a name I chose, living a life built on the ruins of lies and held together with the strongest truth there is. We survived. We chose each other. We became family. The counselor tapped my shoulder that day and asked if I knew where Craig was. I didn't then, but I found him, we all found each other, and that's the only ending that matters. That's it for today's story. Let me know your take in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear more.